In this interview, I'm joined by anthropologist and scholar practitioner Dr. Ben Joffe. We discuss how Ben's early interest in Western occultism led to him becoming a professional tarot reader at 11 years old and to engage in rigorous self-study of magical disciplines. We learn how Ben taught himself the Tibetan language and follow him to India and Nepal, where he carried out his doctoral fieldwork among the Ngakpa community in exile. Ben reveals the methodological and ethical challenges of being both a scholar and a practitioner, and recalls the significance of meeting the man who would later become his teacher and mentor, Dr. Nida Chenagtsang. So, without further ado, Dr. Ben Joffe. Dr. Ben Joffe, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Yes, thanks for having me.
And may I congratulate you on the recent completion of your dissertation, and that we can now call you Dr. Ben Joffe.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. I'm glad it's over. It took a while.
I'd love to delve into your research work and really get into the nitty-gritty. But I thought initially we'd look at your biography and as well as a sort of overview and some of the methodology that you employed in the process of your research. And I know that you had an early interest in the esoteric and were, for example, reading tarot cards professionally at the age of 11. Could you take us back to that time and give us a sense of what it was that sparked your interest and how that interest unfolded in those early days?
Sure. I mean, one can use the term professional tarot card reader, but as you know, with these things, there's hardly a kind of board of review. If I use the term professional tarot card reader, I usually use it to indicate that I'm reading for clients and I'm offering my services as someone with experience. So I was in fact doing that from the age of 11 or so. How I got into that, I don't know. I mean, cliched as it is, I guess I was a strange kid. I didn't have a particularly religious or spiritual upbringing at all. My father is a kind of mild-mannered atheist Jew, and my mother has never particularly been affiliated or interested in any sort of religious tradition. But thankfully, my parents were kind enough to sort of be flexible and supportive of my interests, which emerged very early. I think I had a strong sense from very early on in my life of other realities, of spiritual forces and influences. Growing up in South Africa too, we're such a ethnically, culturally, linguistically, religiously diverse country. And so I think that also helped to expose me to a lot of alternative cosmologies and ways of being, ritual specialists and everyday interactions with spirits are very much a part of the fabric of life in South Africa for many different kinds of South African. So my parents, I guess they saw even before I did as clearly that I was interested in the esoteric, the occult. I was trying to make sense of what, for the want of a better word, you could call spiritual experiences, visionary encounters that sort of happened without much context. And when I was about 10 or 11, my maternal grandmother, who I was very close with, and who I think always she herself wasn't deeply involved in the study of esoteric traditions, witchcraft or anything like that. But I think she sort of styled herself a witch. She was an unconventional woman for her time, and she saw my interest and sort of hoped that maybe I could pick it up. And so her and my parents, sort of around the age of 10, they sort of realized, like, oh, okay, he's into this kind of thing. We don't know much about it, but my parents bought me books on Western occultism, esotericism, ritual magic. My mother and maternal grandmother bought me a pack of tarot cards, which I still use today, actually. I've had them with me for over 22 years, and they're still the primary deck I use to divine with for clients. And yeah, something clicked. Read one book about tarot. It just felt right. I started reading according to the instructions that were there, and it seemed to be effective. My first stint as a reader was actually at a kids. We had a kids TV network in South Africa, KTV, and to sort of stimulate the entrepreneurial spirit in children, they would have this annual thing in different cities where you could apply for a stall, or you sort of pitched a business. So we pitched sort of, I guess, woo. We pitched general woo. My mother and sister sold herbs and candles and sort of vaguely holistic items just as a background feature to me with a trestle table reading for clients who came up. And, you know, I was doing this very naively. I was just following the instructions that I had learned and going along with it and asking people whether it was useful or relevant. And they said yes. And they said, can we see you again? And so this led to me working at a flea market in my hometown. I was charging a pittance, you know, I was charging a couple of cents. I wasn't learning to extort impressionable, desperate people. I was really doing it more for my own interest. And then at that time, and it seemed like it benefited people, so I continued and have done so. And I think as I got older, what started to happen is I realized, oh, not everyone, not all adults, all children for that matter, credit what I'm doing. Not all of them have had experiences that I've had. They don't feel the presence of spiritual forces in the same way that I had. And so I think that instilled in me an early kind of relativism. I was also surrounded by a wonderful collection of characters, of surrogate parents, because, you know, I would spend hours in this open air flea market. Initially, I was by myself, in the middle of nowhere with a trestle table and a sign, and then I made contact with a group of women who ran a crystal stall. And they sold incense, and I guess they were, generally speaking, New Age. And they all had their own affiliations, and then through clients that I saw and people I met who came to the table, I just had a very early, very intimate, sort of human introduction to, I guess, what you could call alternative spirituality, new religious movements, any range of things. I began to do big holistic fairs, esoteric fairs, you know, exhausting situations where you read for people alongside other readers and vendors for hours and hours. And as time went on, I started to also realize what my own interests were. Tarot, I always say tarot was kind of a passport for me into all kinds of domains. South Africa is a strange place to be an occultist. We are one of the few countries, other than I think Saudi Arabia, that has had, or still technically has, a state-supported occult crimes unit, which, in the name of mainstream religious dogma, roots out alternative and satanic spiritual activities and influences. So growing up as a kid and even finding information in the 80s, late 80s and early 90s in South Africa about occultism required, you know, building networks and sort of a lot of self-education and care. I still recall asking to see the 3 paltry books on, you know, Reiki and divination that were in sort of the newsstand, whatever. A sort of breathless, pearl-clutching Afrikaans auntie having to receive a key from the back and open a cupboard behind the counter to show me the 1 pack of tarot cards. You know, I mean, it was still like that. It started changing as I was growing up, but I guess I just read voraciously and I experimented and I met other people, and over the years I had mentors. I became interested probably in my tweens in neo-paganism. various forms of modern witchcraft. And so I met with the small but vibrant communities that were in South Africa and had various mentors in that area. But I was also meeting so many other people, aura healers, Reiki masters, Wiccan high priestesses, alien abductees, contactees, traditional South African spirit mediums and shamans and healers, Christian mystics, spiritualists, Satanists, vampires. So I could see that, like me, all of these people had, they had no reason to be lying about their experiences. Sometimes there were real signs of mental illness or, certain psychologies that always draw people to magic and the occult. But for the most part, through my clients and colleagues and friends, I could see that these were genuine people used to being ridiculed, struggling to make sense of their spiritual lives outside of maybe standard and often quite unforgiving, sort of dominant frameworks and narratives. So I guess it made me so open and interested in so many things, but it also made me more sort of critical. I was like, well, all these people seem very sincere, but not all of their claims or arguments or sources are equivalent. I started reading a lot, and I learned very early on how, I guess, to be an anthropologist, to be a scholar about these things. And I'd had some exposure to Buddhism. There's a small but very significant and active Buddhist community in South Africa, mostly white, upper middle class South African converts. Both Tibetan Buddhism and other forms of Buddhism. And I'd had some early exposure to that. In Tibetan tantric Buddhism, Indo-Tibetan Vajrayana, came a bit later. And it was mostly because I started becoming more specifically interested through neo-paganism in what's often called the Western magical tradition, or kind of contemporary modern ritual magic. And, a lot of that, like tarot itself, owes its ideas and preferences to kind of Victorian Europe, Victorian England, drawing on older sources. And, especially because of the influence of theosophy and the development of the New Age, so much of that, you could say, is kind of a Western esoteric take, a misreading even, a distortion or reworking of Indian, Tibetan religious ideas. So it was quite interesting. I wasn't actively pursuing an interest in Buddhism or Tibetan esotericism for many years, but when I did start to look at primary sources, I realized that I'd been absorbing so much information or sort of distorted forms of Vajrayana or Hinduism, Buddhist philosophy, and so on through Western occult sources. And that was really interesting to me. I hadn't appreciated the extent to which there was that relationship. And I can explain more specifically about how I ended up becoming an anthropologist who studied Tibetan culture and religion in exile. That sort of happened at a particular moment.
That's fascinating. So you alluded there to certain sorts of spiritual experiences in your youth, visionary experience, and also a capacity to feel spiritual forces. So I'm curious if you could comment on some of the specifics there. And also, in many of the Western esoteric traditions, certain people come to mind like the OTO or Franz Bardon, people like that. There is a graded system of mind training. I'm wondering if you ever engaged through your mentors and your own study in any structured mind training, the sort of which you would encounter then later in Buddhism.
Yeah, actually, this is great. Give me 1 second. I want to show you something. So you mentioned the German-speaking Hermeticist Franz Bardon. My personal Tibetan teacher, Dr. Nida Chenagtsang, who I'm sure we'll speak of more, he actually just gave me these books, which is so funny because they were one of the primary manuals that I worked with as a kid. And now that I know more, I can actually see what I believe to be a direct influence of Tibetan Buddhism on many of, maybe direct, I need to be careful about that word, but there's clearly influence that Bardon himself acknowledged. And I think he was getting it from the milieu in which he was in. But yeah, absolutely. To answer your question, I think when I was very young, I was just like most kids. Most kids are sensitive to subtle spiritual forces before they have any sort of cultural or even familial or personal frameworks for making sense of that. I was in a unique position because, by and large, I mean, don't have the stats for you, but I would say that it's always interesting to look at the kind of like demographic patterns of involvement in alternative spirituality. You often hear about the Jubu, the sort of preponderance of well-educated, nice Jewish kids in Western Dharma, American Buddhism, and so on. Of course, they're not the only demographic, but in occultism, Western occultism, and especially these very sort of tantra influenced forms of it, like left-hand path traditions and so on. Many people come to these practices because they're Christian, and because they had kind of traumatic Christian upbringings, which they are responding to. I had no religious upbringing, bar what we got from school and just living in a Christian-centric country. But yeah, I guess when I was a kid, I had a lot of dreams, and as I got a bit older, there would be moments. I can remember very specific events, very specific. Had one very dramatic visionary encounter just in my room, unprovoked by any, unsolicited, with Jesus, what appeared to be Christ, and which was an overwhelming experience that made me, I often bring it up to people to sort of to convey my orientation to these things. I think I was maybe like 8 or 9. I can't quite remember. I wish I had written it down, like I subsequently started doing as part of Crowley-influenced ritual magic. You have a magical diary, you do daily exercises and meditations, you write down your results. It's sort of this empirical approach. But this early encounter, it just sort of happened, and I was in a cathedral suddenly for no particular reason. I think I'd been meditating. I don't know if I even knew that word yet, but I was in a cathedral, and there was a very palpable mood of sort of awe and slight danger. And there's a giant image of an open-armed Christ in stained glass. And then the mood sort of intensified, and hundreds of white owls broke through the glass, flapping everywhere, and there was just blinding light that came through the sort of kind of crude outline of Christ. And that light, I understood, was what that picture was of. And I felt an overwhelming sense of bliss and peace, and just a level of boundless compassion that was so overwhelming that I wept, and I fell down on the ground, and I was like, what do I do with this? So I actually said the Lord's Prayer, because in my supposedly secular government school, we still went to assemblies where we would sing a different variety of Christian hymns. Later, my school was half Indian, South African. About half the population was Hindu. But later, they even tried to introduce some Hindu songs because they realized it was not constitutional to have us only sing these. But I said the Lord's Prayer with deep, earnest feeling, because I was like, well, this is I guess this is Jesus. I really believe it. But after that, I sort of wiped the tears away, and I put that in my back pocket, and I went downstairs to dinner. I didn't tell my parents about it. I actually didn't tell anyone about it. for many years. But I never became a Christian. I already knew I didn't want to. I had enough exposure to Christianity I was just not interested. Of course, I was studying Christian mysticism later on, quite moved by it. But I guess those sorts of experiences, especially in the absence of a family who could say like, "Oh, you met Jesus? Like, psyched, we're into this," or like, "You need to see a psychiatrist." There was none of that. So for me, it was more just, it instilled in me a sort of interest in like, what is this? What is my mind doing? And then through clients and other people, they're also telling me, I talk to angels, I know Jesus, aliens steal my body fluids. And so I was like, okay, well, what is all this? Like, I can't dismiss these people and their experiences when I'm also kind of in that boat with them, but I'm not about to just automatically say, okay, well, I met Jesus, so now I'm a prophet or I'm a Christian. It was never like that for me. It was always more like something's going on. How things look immediately on the surface, how we describe them culturally, they're relative, circumstantial, and they're one layer for something else. So I guess I became a kind of agnostic relativist even before my training as an anthropologist required that of me, just for sort of rigorous scholarship, because I was having these kinds of experiences and exposures. And then just to quickly touch on the last part of your question, absolutely, yeah. Once I became involved in sort of various forms of paganism and witchcraft, and then especially when I became involved in sort of Golden Dawn, Crowley-influenced ritual magic, I was doing rituals and meditations every single day throughout high school, and really beating myself up about it too. You know, like diarizing this and always feeling like I should be cultivating my spiritual capacities more. You know, now I feel like I was more disciplined. You know, I was getting up at 5 a.m. of my own volition, not with the mother telling me to, you know, do Bardon's step 1 exercise, yogic exercises of dousing myself with cold water and rubbing myself with a bristle brush and doing pour breathing. And I taught myself hypnosis to use on myself, and then I started experimenting with using it on others. I was constantly reading and connecting with people and practicing. I always felt that I could be practicing more. I worked mostly by myself, though. Occasionally I had mentors. Some were really creepy characters, especially for a kid, you know. But you know, like, you find your way with the help of others and by yourself. But I was mostly by myself. I had a dream. I actually tried to join many, I wouldn't say many, but 2 or 3 lodges, Western occult groups that were abroad, mostly in the UK, because I yearned for, you know, structure and a teacher who could say, like, you know, I'm going to follow your progress, and, you know, so that I wasn't just doing it by myself, because I wanted structure and constancy and mentors that I could count on. And I was too young. I was like 15, 16. Most of them told me, we don't allow anyone into our lodges that young. And so they just said, you know, do your own study. And yeah, I didn't ever officially join until I became more involved in Vajrayana. I didn't officially initiate into any group, really. And then during my 10-year PhD period, at least the beginning of it, I sort of moved away, both because of practicality and time, but also I felt like I was sort of needed to challenge myself to be maybe more of a skeptical academic on my own and others' experiences, and I was still involved in practicing every day, but not with the same naivete and deep dedication and desire for adepthood that I had when I was like 12 to kind of 20. I've seen this period of time in academia has really been sort of a phase in my life where I stepped out of intensive personal practice and sort of took a meta view of my own experience. Now I feel like I'm coming out of that phase, actually. So it's interesting. Yeah. Anyway, so yeah, Bardon is an old friend for sure, and I was following Crowley's advice to keep a magical diary and doing a hodgepodge of things. I think I always had sort of anxiety about the hodgepodgeness of it all, and yet was also quite thrilled by the experimental kind of, I don't know what's going on, I don't know what spurts are out there. I liked the creativity and the freedom of it, and yet there was always a part of me that wished that I had something like a traditional structure and kind of older sources, because there's so much creativity and innovation and bald-faced lying and misrepresentation and syncretism, and in Western occultism, the mind truly boggles. There are many pros and many cons to that. I personally believe so. Yeah, that was my experience.
Amazing. Why do you think Dr. Nida gave you that Franz Bardon book, number one? And number two, I think this idea of the Western occult traditions being something that has a progressive training in really things like training of the mind, training of the imagination, training of concentration, the sorts of things I think most people would associate with Buddhism, but many aren't aware that that's in the Western esoteric traditions.
Well, this might get me in trouble, but I would actually say that, there's this pattern that we see in Western sort of Tibetan Buddhist Dharma centers, where a visiting Lama comes who has an incredible wealth of training and knowledge, having been brought up in a society where this is encouraged and supported and institutionalized, who then provides a transmission. Maybe the resident translator translates the sadhana text, and the students get told, okay, just do it. And I really think that a lot of Western occult, often it's in the form of individual authors and sometimes lodges, although I hesitate to, lodges are a whole other story. But, there are training programs in the Western occult context which are far more explicit and clear for beginners, which really outline in very clear terms the theory and practice of these methods. And it's not that stuff doesn't exist in Vajrayana. It absolutely does, as part of oral and written lineage traditions. But it's often within the sort of structural rule space of Western Dharma centers. It's just often not there for students or easily accessible, or they need to learn Tibetan in order to get it, or have precious time with gurus who are not always available to kind of track their progress. So I, as much as I may have given the impression that the Western occult scene is just everybody doing what they like and making stuff up and declaring themselves authorities, and it's kind of a mess. There is a level of rigor and structure there too that sometimes, for various reasons, can be lacking for those who might want it, like converts, non-heritage Buddhists, or even Tibetan Buddhists who also may struggle to, unless they're apprenticed to a teacher and living very closely with them, to sort of to get that.
That's right, and that's sort of my point. So my question is to you is, what experiences did you have, or what development did you notice when you were so immersed in that self-training as a teenager? And also, footnote, not to forget about why did Nida give you the Franz Bardon books?
Oh, well, and you'll see this one here. It's actually is the cover. I don't know that I have a friend who is doing a lot of interesting publishing and scholarship around Bardon and his legacy. I should ask her and her partner about this cover. I actually don't know who made this cover and why it features so many Tibetan-like images. But it was very simple. I was having a meeting with Nida in New York recently after a dream yoga workshop that he gave at Tibet House, and we were talking about future publication plans, and I was recording some Q&A with him for that purpose. And he said, I saw a student of mine, I think a European student of his, who said, I think there'd been a miscommunication because Nida was under the impression that these were his books written by his student. So I explained, by the student who gave them to him, he said, these are my books. So I explained to Nida that Bardon was long dead and told him a little bit about him and how I thought that he actually taught a kind of Vajrayana-like set of practices. So Nida said to me, "Oh well, you have them. You know about this. Do you want them?" I mean, he wasn't. He decided that they'd be more useful to me than to him. So perhaps this is why, so that we could talk about them now. Yeah. I mean, I still recommend Bardon's initiation into Hermetics to people. In terms of what that kind of training did for me, well, yeah, it absolutely did what's in Crowley's Liber O, his sort of one of his most practical manuals. I love his opening quote, where he's just so thoroughly kind of modern occultism. This sort of agnosticism. He says, in this book I speak of Sephirot, of the tree of life. I speak of astral planes and deities. It's irrelevant whether any of these things actually exist or not. The point of these exercises is that when you do them, they have two results. If I paraphrase him now, he says, they widen the scope of the mind, and they strengthen the capacity and strength of the mind. And then he says, if you do these exercises, you will have encounters. You will you will amplify your sensitivity to spiritual forces, to spirits. You will have mystical experiences of mystical union. You will develop your clairvoyance. You will improve your ability to have clear and prophetic dreams, or remember your dreams, or have lucid dreams, or many of the same kinds of things that we find in Vajrayana sadhana practice. So yeah, when it's definitely true, and an anthropologist, Tanya Lerman, has spoken about this a lot, because she also kind of did her PhD research by initiating agnostically into Western witchcraft, Western ritual magic groups in the UK. And she's since kind of immersed herself in many different spiritual groups, all without becoming a believer or wanting to become a believer, but fascinated by this sort of transformative process that happens when people engage with a structured kind of spiritual discipline. And she's written a lot about this. And it's true what she says, based on my own experience. The more you engage with these practices, the more they shape your experience, the more they unfold latent capacities of body, emotion, and mind. So I can see, because I had this sort of 10-year slight hiatus from regular daily practice and exploration, where I can see how being involved in that, they fall off to a certain degree. People come to yoga and meditation and magic with pre-existing capacities or talents, or none, and then they develop them and refine them. And then you can also, it's not so much that those capacities disappear. I'm loath to say that they, because obviously the skeptical, sort of dismissive angle on this is, well, people see spirits and hear spirits or talk to God when they're in a community and doing practices to induce those experiences. If they stop doing those practices, they won't have them. Yes and no. What I've learned from my own life trajectory is that when you become less involved in the practices, it's remarkable how easy it is to forget, I would say. It's remarkable how easy it is to become when you've been a lucid dreamer, remembering reams of dreams for years and years effortlessly, and then you just get distracted with something else. You suddenly find yourself living, you don't even remember your dreams anymore. There have been phases of my life where that happens. So I know that I'm not having dreams. It's just really a question of attention and the cultivation and training of attention and intention. So I don't want to say that these experiences are fabricated, that they're produced by these bizarre cultural activities that people opt into. Tanya Lerman herself sort of made that argument with her concept of interpretive drift, which has a lot of value to it, but it didn't go down well in the practitioner community, because it was read as her sort of saying that spirits and magic aren't real, they don't work, a priori. But if you do the practices, you'll start to sort of feel like they do. And there is something very profound and important to that. But I think that as someone who came to this sort of from without any context and had a lot of experiences spontaneously, it was because these experiences just happened that I then sought out the kind of structured practices and communities. And then through being involved with those, I also came to realize that regular practice does refine and unfold these kinds of capacities. And it's possible also to kind of like completely focus your attention away from those things. So, and I know from experience how grad school kind of overwhelmed me, and how sometimes I'm like, how did I get from there to here? But then all it takes is for me to just be like, oh, I'm not touching in with my body, or oh, I'm doing a meditation practice, and I'm like, all right, it's all here. All those capacities are still there. It's amazing. It's really instructive how easy, not choosing to train and focus one's attention in a particular way. That's its own kind of attention training. We choose. It's like in Buddhism, we choose to attach ourselves to samsaric interests, to samsaric orientations, and we can also opt out of those too. It's very interesting. I'm really interested in the kind of this aspect of spiritual disciplines as practices that one actually has to invest in. I don't think they explain why people have quote-unquote paranormal or experiences or supernatural spiritual encounters. They don't at all. We have, an endless amount of material in anthropology and other disciplines to show that countless people have spooky experiences, throughout their lives without anything like this. It's very interesting, that relationship, though, in terms of practice. And it's one that Buddhists talk about a lot. They're like, we all have latent Buddha nature. And yet somehow, so if everything is perfect and nothing needs to be done, why are we doing so much shit all the time with such dedication? Why do we keep having to remind ourselves? That's a whole other question, but we do. And it's not because, in my opinion, that it's untrue that there's really innate Buddha nature and that we're sort of just fabricating this experience. No, it's about the boundless capacity for human beings to get distracted and to not even realize what's always there, right under their nose. So, that's kind of my take on it.
You've described your entry into the world of Tibetan studies as a nerd rebellion. So can you sort of take us from, before we go into the actual research period itself, could you take us from what, living in South Africa and doing what you were doing there to this nerd rebellion of entering Tibetan studies?
The reason I said that was specifically in relationship to how I became interested in studying Tibetan language. So I think that, as I mentioned before, I had some exposure to Buddhists and Buddhism growing up in South Africa. Just for the record, my initial exposure to Tibet came from two places. And I think I must have been, about 11 when this happened. I knew a woman who was at the same flea market where I used to work, who studied sort of Hermetic Kabbalah, and she was an artist, and she created these kinds of astrological, Kabbalistic inspired tarot cards for their soul, basically. Very awesome stuff. But she had a husband who was a extremely dedicated Tibet activist. And he actually was not a Tibetan Buddhist practitioner, which was sort of unusual. But he really felt strongly about China's colonizing of Tibet and gross human rights violations that have happened there and are happening there. And he was involved with the Tibet House that we actually have in South Africa, which is a bit unusual because, there's a sort of preponderance of Tibet houses. It's kind of the system that developed through, formal and informal networks of support with Tibetan refugee communities and the Dalai Lama's exile administration in the past, where the central Tibetan administration, the exile government, if you like, although terminology has changed, in recent years, they have these sort of de facto offices in various sort of strategic locations around the world. But they also happen to have one in South Africa, which is a little strange because there's no local Tibetan refugee population to speak of, like there is, say, in the case of the U.S. or France or something like that. But there is this sort of fairly long-standing and dedicated convert population. Anyway, my friend's husband had been involved with the Tibet House, and it's that version of it's in that version of it. And I remember as a kid, talking to my friend and hearing him speak to the officials at Tibet House, or seeing parcels that he'd received from India or something, and I sort of just was like, okay, knew nothing about Tibet, wasn't trying to find anything out. And then I think around that time I also read Lobsang Rampa's The Third Eye. I found it in I was not sufficiently educated in Tibetan studies at that point to know that this biography of a mystically endowed Lama from Lhasa was actually a kind of channeled text by a Scottish plumber who'd never left the British Isles, who claimed his body had been possessed by a Tibetan Lama who wanted to use him as a mouthpiece. And really, I didn't understand then either that most of what was in his book was theosophy and not really authentic Tibetan history or Buddhism. But, so that was a little early exposure. But the nerd rebellion you spoke about came sort of towards the end of my honors year, my fourth year at the University of Cape Town. I had done some sort of initial ethnographic fieldwork with neo-pagans in South Africa. And it had been a kind of strange experience because even though I was working with groups who I didn't necessarily feel were doing the same practices as me, we were part of a shared family, and it was to a certain extent an initial foray into autoethnography. And some of my professors found this deeply troubling. Some of them sort of revealed their own cosmological standpoints when they said, is it a good idea for you to do research with people who practice magic? What if it would be dangerous? I recall when one professor said that, she was the only one who fielded that possibility during the review of my research proposal in the department, and others sort of looked at her like, wait, you actually believe the magic could work? So props to her. Others said, we don't know if it's healthy or safe for you to be involved with a community that's so close to you. So I'd had a strange experience doing that research. I had some pushback from people who felt I was too much of a scholar practitioner and that this was an issue. I don't really see that it ended up being one, but it was an interesting moment. And I was unsure about whether I was even going to continue with academia because I was sort of a little bit disabused after this experience. And I'd become more interested in Buddhism and Vajrayana. I started reading more. I one or two books. And then I love languages. I've learned many languages. And I remember I was procrastinating finishing a final paper or something, like my last big paper for my a class, like a graduate level class. And as I often do in these situations, I thought, well, this would be a great time to bury myself in something completely unrelated to this pressing task, but which is also really intellectually demanding and consuming. So this is what I call my kind of nerd rebellion. I got sort of this strong impulse, and I thought, I have to learn Tibetan. I was like, how the hell am I going to learn Tibetan? So I've never met a Tibetan. So I went to the university library, and I found Sir Charles Bell's, I think it's from the turn of the century, his colloquial Tibetan book. And I taught myself how to read and write Tibetan without ever having heard the language spoken. I didn't have regular internet access, so I couldn't just easily go on YouTube and even hear the language. I remember when I ordered from, it still does, but it used to take forever to order a book from overseas to get through customs in South Africa. I remember I finally got this modern Tibetan textbook, and it had a CD, and I put it into my computer, and it had like a recording of a Tibetan speaking. And I thought, oh shit, this is what Tibetan sounds like? I had no idea. I mean, I could read already, perfunctory sentences or whatever. And I was like, oh crap, that is totally not what I thought it would sound like. But then, that then led me to become more interested in the history of Buddhist convert communities in South Africa. And I toyed with the idea of doing a master's through my anthropology department, looking at Buddhists in South Africa as a religious minority. And then my advisor had actually done research in India on witchcraft, violence, and accusations in India, central India. And she said to me, how do you know there's not... She's like, I've had some encounters with Tibetan refugees in India. She's like, how do you know there's no Tibetans in South Africa? At the time, I'd forgotten about my lovely friend, who's since passed away, and his connection with Tibet House. And then I realized, there is a office of Tibet in Centurion, South Africa, in Gauteng province, with sort of 2 families of Tibetans. And I made contact with them, and I said, I've become really interested in Tibetan exile politics, and just the prospect that an entire nation could be erased from the map overnight by a colonial superpower. And I said, I'm beginning to learn Tibetan. I took a bus out, and I met with the representatives at the office. And I said to them, I'm thinking about doing a master's, and I wonder if I might work with you, do field work with you, and just learn about what it's like for you being here in Afrikaner suburbia in the middle of South Africa after the Dalai Lama had been denied access for the first and subsequent, that continues today. South Africa refuses to allow His Holiness the Dalai Lama to visit, get a visa. So I was just fascinated. I was starting to sort of give myself a crash course. The Tibetan language just started as a kind of procrastinatory impulse, but backed up by my kind of interest in Vajrayana that was slowly developing. And then I became really interested in Tibetans. I knew, as someone who already had anthropological training, that I didn't just want to learn about Buddhism and Buddhist philosophy from books. I didn't want to learn about Tibetan language as a hypothetical. I wanted to understand what it meant to practice Tibetan Buddhism as a convert and as a native Tibetan in the world today, in everyday life, given the social, cultural, political complexities of global Dharma, of the Chinese occupation of Tibet, of a scattering of refugee Tibetans in a diaspora over the last decades. I wasn't foolish enough to think that one simply studies a language or becomes involved with a religion outside of a socio-political, historical context. So it was really important to me that I just met Tibetans. And so I had a wonderful experience being invited into the world of these de facto ambassadors for a de facto country in a far-flung outpost of the diasporic scene, political network, social network. And, I did the best I could, having a field site that was Tibetans in South Africa, who may have even been the only Tibetans in the whole African continent. And I had a great experience doing that research. And I knew that I wanted to learn more about Tibetan studies through an anthropological lens. And so I made contact with my former advisor, who is a historian and anthropologist who specializes in the study of exile Tibetan history and culture. And there's not a lot of anthropologists who have really sort of good expertise in Tibetan studies as well. You know, you often have to study Tibetan studies sort of through Buddhist studies or in a Tibetan studies department that maybe emphasizes texts over like anthropological sort of preferences of like everyday life and you know, culture and context and ethnography. So I did all the paperwork and I applied to the University of Colorado Boulder in 2010 and was accepted to work with this advisor, Dr. Carol McGranahan, and I've been in the US ever since. And this led to my PhD and completion of my PhD and my current work. So I guess that should sort of get you up to speed. Yeah, but it did. I don't know if the nerd rebellion started it. Maybe it was my dear friend's like phone call that day. I still remember. It's interesting. I don't. At the time, I remember telling his wife, I really am interested in Tibet, but I didn't feel this urge to go up to him and say, who are the Tibetans you were talking to on the phone? Or what's this? I remember he received what looked like an ordinary envelope, but the inside of it had silk inside. And someone had sent him, I think, some texts, some religious texts, just as a gift or something. I don't know. I remember thinking, like, who could these people be that could have sent a book like this? But it wasn't enough at the time to make me take the path that I did, to really decide, like, I'm going to leave South Africa for the first time in my life, and because I believe I need to study Tibetan language and learn about Tibetan Buddhism first, you know, by getting to know Tibetans in exile. And then I said to myself, only then can you decide whether you might practice. You know, you need to know about Tibetan Buddhism as something that is a community reality for people. I always had that strong sense. I was like, I'm a non-Tibetan, potentially becoming involved in a spiritual tradition that is not exclusive to Tibetans, but does belong to them. And that was always very clear in my consciousness. It still is. And it's also been clear in my thinking in terms of how the sorts of things I've been interested in writing about as a scholar and thinking about as a scholar.
Seeing as you've brought that up, could you talk a bit about how your study of the Tibetan language unfolded, both in terms of the timeline of your study and also in terms of the methodologies you found the most effective?
I sort of knew that I'd reached a point where I needed to learn Tibetan language in an immersive way. I couldn't just be reading textbooks on the beach in Cape Town while my friends laughed at me, muttering to myself in Tibetan or listening to recordings after having only met and interacted on a daily basis with like 3 Tibetans for 6 months. So I found ways to fund trips to India. My first visit to McLeod Ganj was in 2010, just after I completed my master's at the University of Cape Town. And I discovered that there was a bursary that was available to students. You could be from any department. It was this old white lady who I can only assume was a dedicated theosophist who left a whole lot of money. And she, I say this not facetiously. I think from the evidence that I saw that she was a theosophist, or at least affiliated. And she put aside this incredible, or her family managed this, not a huge amount of money, but a small amount of money, where it said any South African student at the University of Cape Town who wants to visit 2 Asian countries in order to learn about indigenous Asian religious traditions, Buddhism, Taoism, Shintoism, and so on, firsthand, could apply and get money to go and just spend a couple of months, like, on a spiritual journey So I remember being in that interview and actually saying to them, like, I'm an anthropologist. I need you to know, I'm not going to lie. Like, I primarily want to study Tibetan language in a rigorous and Tibetan, Buddhism in a rigorous scholarly way. I'm not just on some kind of hippy-dippy joy right here. I remember being quite firm about that, but they granted me the bursary, and I was able to go to India for the first time in my life. And I immediately began sort of just having relaxed conversation classes. I had some basis because I had studied by myself for a little while. And then when I decided to come to the US, a big draw of that was the prospect of being able to have lessons. So I had also some conversation classes with a Lama in Boulder, only for a few months, and then tried to sort of just be doing all my grad school stuff while also, improving my Tibetan through self-study. But I also, up until that point, had only really focused on colloquial Tibetan. And I personally believe that if you're going to learn Tibetan, it's just a no-brainer. You have to learn to speak and read. But I say that because there's a common tendency in Buddhist studies and Tibetan studies where many scholars learn to read classical literary Tibetan, which is admittedly different to spoken Tibetan, which comes in many dialectal varieties. And you can't just instantly jump. It's a bit like Arabic. You can't instantly jump from text to speaking or vice versa. Many native Tibetans who are fluent in their spoken languages are illiterate or struggle with reading. So it's, it's not that it just happens. I prioritized speaking Tibetan, but I was still frustrated. Only when I started my long stint of fieldwork for about 2 years, just under 2 years, starting from the beginning of 2015, and I was really just in a position to be in Tibetan spaces and communities in India and Nepal, then my Tibetan really improved. But I had this interesting moment where I realized, I'm deigning to do research on Tibetan esotericism and Vajrayana, but I don't even know how to read Tibetan. When I arrived in the field, I still really struggled to read Tibetan. And I realized kind of with panic, I was like, Lamas are not going to take me very seriously if I want to talk to them about their religious lives without being able to engage with text the way they do. But I had always sort of styled myself an anthropologist. I'm not a textualist scholar. So kind of with panic, a little into fieldwork, I was like, oh, crap, I have to learn how to read Tibetan. So I really just taught myself how to read Tibetan. I never had formal classes in that. I read some books and I really just started reading every day, little bits and pieces. And I still consider my level of Tibetan, I do not consider myself to be fluent in Tibetan. I have not gone through, I would consider fluency in Tibetan to have been living in an exclusively Tibetan language environment on a day-to-day basis for several years. This is living in a monastery, for example. And then also I haven't had lessons in Tibetan composition. I don't know how to write good Tibetan. So I'm, there are many non-Tibetan scholars who are the same as me. I'm no longer interested in pursuing an academic career or seeking jobs where I would be required to present myself as an expert. I work to the best of my ability in consultation with, my teachers. But my spoken Tibetan was much better in 2016 than it is now because I'm not communicating every day, unfortunately. But I would say to people the same thing I'd say for learning any language, because Tibetan has an association. It's a sacred language. It's associated with this incredible, profound, centuries-long tradition of spiritual knowledge. People get sort of weird ideas about that somehow the learning of it is equally miraculous or equally unique if you're going to learn to read Tibetan sadhanas, you should learn Tibetan the same way you should learn in Spanish, any language. It is very interesting how people feel they can get away with having no familiarity with colloquial Tibetan or even Tibetans sometimes. No warmth or familiarity with Tibetans, but they can still sort of be familiar and warm towards texts, which has never made sense to me. But to an extent, you can get away with it. So it's a peculiar thing. We have people studying Tibetan language as if it were like Greek or Latin. They sort of, when you sound some people out, they're sort of approaching the language as if there's no living community of users and speakers of these texts and words. And I just always thought that's so strange. A lot of people will freely say, I'm a convert. It's too much effort for me to learn to speak, to shoot the shit with like Tibetans in a bar in India. And anyway, that's not what I'm interested in. But I'm like, some of the great lamas who wrote your sadhanas shot this shit in the bar themselves. I don't know. It's an interesting thing. And I still consider myself a student of Tibetan language and culture. Absolutely. It's part of the reason why I felt so uncomfortable having got the PhD, feeling like I then had to position myself as some, for the sake of my career advancement, I had to then say, and yeah, I know a lot. I have a certain amount of expertise, but I would never take a job from a native Tibetan who was way more qualified than me. And unfortunately, Tibetan studies is surprisingly un-Tibetan as a discipline. That's a whole other story. But I didn't have a lot of formal education in Tibetan language. I also learned Tibetan to a large extent by teaching English to Tibetans, just for something to do, but also, especially Tibetans who didn't know English at all would be, I would then have to, use my awful Tibetan to try to convey English to them. And so, there were a lot of ways that I learned. But yeah, I encourage people to not forget that Tibetan is a language, a living language, and that immersion is always going to be the best way. Above and beyond the formal learning of grammar categories. It's an interesting thing, like Tibetans will often say, if you ask them, do you know Tibetan? They're fluent native speakers. And they'll say, no, I don't know Tibetan. What they mean is they haven't studied sort of doctoral, like grammar. They haven't been in a monastic context and studied formal grammar texts. So there's levels of language and levels of authority to that go along with it. I'm more of the school that when you were a little baby, you were absorbing an understanding of the context in which the subjunctive mood are used in the English language without ever having to know what the subjunctive mood was. And in my experience of teaching Tibetans English, many Tibetans were really very good at English grammar, but they couldn't speak English. They knew what the subjunctive mood was because they'd carried textbooks, Oxford English textbooks around like talismans for years, just like I did with my Tibetan textbooks. But ultimately, if you want to really understand a language, you can't just be looking at a dictionary or translating technical term after technical term. Sometimes you can get away with that, translating sadhanas, which have very clipped, concise language that's highly jargon-laden. But that's not really understanding a language. I wish more sort of self-declared translators or consumers of classical Tibetan would allow themselves the pleasure of learning Tibetan as a living language. So that's my spiel.
That's fantastic, man. So you mentioned you speak several other languages.
Oh, badly.
That's all right. What's the list?
I speak English. I consider English to be the only language I speak fluently, and I speak it fluently too much. um, uh, I I have a degree, an undergraduate degree in French language and literature, but I've never had the opportunity to live for a long period of time in a francophone country. Um, I know Afrikaans because everyone knows Afrikaans in South Africa and studied it in school. I studied Hebrew and Arabic and Latin for several years, but those have all dribbled out my ear. I also learned isiZulu and Xhosa, two indigenous South African languages, which have also dribbled out my ear, and I sort of reached a point of proficiency and never went beyond it. So I only really would say I know Tibetan English and French, even though I have studied many languages.
I picked up a bit of Xhosa when I was I stayed in Kailicha for a period of time, so I picked up a bit of, what is it, Nkosi, Igamalam Steve, something like this.
Nice, yeah.
That's wonderful. That's such a fascinating language, Xhosa.
Yeah, I love languages as an entry point into worlds and cosmologies because I guess I'm a natural anthropologist, and I really believe that that it's just an amazing, like magical, transformative way to occupy alternative positions and vantage points on reality. I really, it's interesting. My linguist friends will often say, they speak very guardedly and sort of hesitantly about what anthropologists call the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which you may be familiar with. It's the idea that the language that you speak can actually influence how you perceive reality. And it's kind of a battleground. It was the reason that anthropology and linguistics kind of split as disciplines to a certain extent. On the one hand, you have universal grammar, and on the other hand, you have this more kind of like relativist take. And there's kind of been a revival of Sapir-Whorf thinking. It was also the main plot line of the movie Arrival with Amy Adams. The idea that if aliens came and we learned their language and they didn't exist in regular space-time, maybe we could also not exist in regular space-time, linear space-time. So it's funny because cultural anthropologists, even if it's sort of unproven beyond their personal experience, every one of them I know is like, yeah, of course this is a Sapir-Whorf hypothesis has credibility. Of course learning another language immerses you in an alternative world that will transform your perception. Are you kidding me? So it's funny how our disciplines have just sort of different feelings about that. But I really do. I really am inclined towards an Amy Adams alien squid approach to language. Especially if you're trying to learn a spiritual tradition, which is so much about felt sense and transforming perception.
And the means of transmission of that particular, the one we're talking about, through oral transmission, through recitation, through memorization, a rich textual tradition. Language is a large part of the means of the transmission and practice of that tradition.
Right. In tantric traditions, the letters exist within the subtle channels. The letters exist as cosmological forces. Seed syllables are real potencies, responsive, sentient forces in the world and in your own being. It's hard sometimes for people to fully sort of grasp if they're moving from a context where they haven't grown up with kind of like alphabet mysticism, like we find in Judaism, Buddhism and Hinduism. It can be hard to sort of overemphasize how much language is. Understanding something like the Terma tradition or certain Vajrayana practices more generally, without sort of reorienting your relationship to what language and speech actually is. It's a whole other worldview about what words even are. But now I'm going on an anthropological tangent.
It is something that's in, of course, the Western tradition, this idea of logos and so on. But it's not prominent in the culture of our Western religion, I think, these days. It's not emphasized.
Yeah, for sure. I always say to people like, studying Hebrew and studying Kabbalah, there's this book, Kabbalistic text, Sefer HaBahir, the book of glare or brightness. And the name of the book, Bahir, starts with the second letter of the Hebrew alphabet, Beit. And a lot of the discussion in the text is, why does the Hebrew Bible, sorry, that's a terrible term, Hebrew Bible, why does the Torah begin with the second letter of the Hebrew alphabet and not the first? If it's, the beginning of all things and the be-all and end-all, why B and not A? And so there's this soaring philosophical investigation, this mystical excursion that that we see in this text, which I guess to one person might seem like the most egregious example of apologetics, the craziest, the most crazy version of what could we call it, like obsessive compulsive religious disorder. Like, you're so obsessed with this book that you're disturbed by the fact that it begins with B and not A, and you need to account for this. But when you read that book and you see what stunning insights about the nature of being are revealed through that exercise, it's just remarkable. Rabbis talk about having to look at the negative space formed by Hebrew letters, as well as the shape of the visible ink, and how both teach us something. It's a level of relating to the written word that is hard for people to grasp and appreciate if they haven't grown up with the language that exists on multiple levels and has transformative power.
Fascinating. Well, I think we should probably get around to talking about your dissertation, shouldn't we?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's terrific. So the title of your dissertation is White Robes, Matted Hair, Tibetan Tantric Householders, Moral Sexuality, and the Ambiguities of Esoteric Buddhist Expertise in Exile, by Dr. Ben Philip Joffe.
It's a short title.
Yes. So I thought actually I'd read your abstract just to position it and save you a bit of legwork, so we can go into some of my questions about it rather than just having you explain it. So I can read the extract, or abstract, or you could read the abstract. What would you prefer?
I don't know. Would you like me to read it with my South African inflections? Okay, so the abstract says, this dissertation offers an ethnographic study of Ngakpa and Ngakma, which is male and female terms, Tibetan Buddhist, non-monastic, non-celibate tantric yogis and yoginis living in the Tibetan diaspora. Like monks and nuns, Ngakpa and Ngakma are professionally religious, yet unlike their monastic counterparts, they can marry, have families, and pursue worldly work. Living in the village, like ordinary lay people, but also spending much of their time in retreat or working as ritual specialists for hire, Ngakpa and Ngakma occupy a shifting third space between monastic renunciation and worldly attachments. Based on roughly 5 years of fieldwork research conducted in Tibetan and Tibetan Buddhist communities in India, Nepal, northeastern Tibet, and the United States, this thesis explores how Ngakpa and Ngakma's historically decentralized, morally ambiguous esoteric expertise has become implicated in various projects of cultural preservation and reform for exiled Tibetans, even as their expertise, has come to circulate and have meaning well beyond the purview of ethnic Tibetan communities and interests. Chapters 1 to 5 offer an overview of how Ngakpa and Ngakma's orientations have been pinned down or have failed to be pinned down in exile via language, gendered divisions of labor, in physical space and permanent institutions, through hair, clothing, and embodied comportment, and as part of new family and career trajectories. Chapters 6 to 9 examine how contentious esoteric tantric yogic practices associated with sexuality and Tibetan medicine in particular are being popularized and reframed in exile in new ways, and for new audiences as part of increasingly transnational networks of exchange. In these chapters, I underscore the polysemous quality of tantric practices and reflect on my own collaborations with the Tibetan Ngakpa doctor to translate and share information on Tibetan tantric yogic practices more widely. In conclusion, I assess trends and quandaries that have dominated the academic study of secrecy and esoteric religions and highlight the implications and value of an ethnographic approach to researching tantric traditions.
Thank you very much. It's an absolutely fascinating topic. Your research spans several years. Could you give us a sort of bird's eye view overview of your research period and the different phases that it went through? I mean, I know that just the bureaucracy involved in organizing visas and so on was extremely challenging for you. But yeah. Can you give us sort of a bit of a summary of the entire process and say?
I'm not going to go into great detail about the visa issues. I'll just say that, it's challenging when you're an anthropologist because normally what happens with PhDs, let's say you're a chemist or you're a zoologist or a biologist and you're doing a PhD, you're doing, unique research. Maybe you like all other PhD students, including cultural anthropologists, social anthropologists, you do several years of classes, graduate level courses. You do literature review. You get your technical training, and then you write your dissertation once your proposals and such have been approved. If you're a zoologist, you might be doing research in a lab on campus while you're also working as a TA or doing other things. So, that shortens the length of PhDs. Because in contrast, if you're a cultural anthropologist, you do all that stuff. You do your language training or your technical training, methodological training, your theory classes, and then you have to write proposals for long-term fieldwork. It's unusual for anyone to write a PhD in cultural anthropology in the United States that's based on anything less than 1 full year of immersive fieldwork. And that fieldwork could be in a home community in the US, or it could be anywhere in the world. It could be virtual, digital ethnography, but it's usually that length of time, and usually much longer, because anthropology graduate students are doing like preliminary exploratory, visits to the field over several years. And so then if you're not at an Ivy League university and you need to self-fund, anywhere from 1 to 2 years of research, that also takes time. So you're often waiting for at least a year to hear about whether you even got the funding. Unfortunately, many universities like my previous one also have strains that disadvantage cultural anthropologists. So they say that once you're ABD, once you're all but dissertation as a PhD student, you're just writing the dissertation, you're not allowed to take time off from your program, which is terrible if you're a cultural anthropologist, because we become ABD through our departments. Then we, seek funding, or hopefully have it already, and then we go off for 2 years, and then we only come back and write. So my situation was challenging because I was a South African national on a US student visa, having to juggle and maintain requirements for that visa status, which typically mean that you have to be full-time enrolled in the US, jumping through certain hoops, while also trying to get research visas to do research in India, Nepal, and Tibet, and be away from the US for months and months. So it was a bit of a visa juggle, and I had a very protracted process that I describe in the acknowledgements briefly in the dissertation, just relating to getting permission to even arrive in the field. I initially thought that I was going to study Tibetan medicine when I first got to my department. And then through conversations with my advisor, I realized not knowing anything about Tibetan studies, that Tibetan medicine had become quite a hot topic in the last 5 or so years. And she cautioned me against studying that if I didn't have a sense of how I would insert myself into these existing academic conversations. When I was in the program building up, I sort of developed research plans around studying Tibetan spirit mediums at various levels of institutionalization. And my early preliminary visits to the field were sort of focused around that. And then for various reasons, I realized that some of my projected proposals might not work out, or I didn't feel comfortable pursuing that. And like so many anthropologists, I just sort of serendipitously fell upon some sort of other ideas. We always say in anthropology, you defend and you write this research grant, you get given all this money, and then you go to the field, and then everyone's like, oh, that's dumb. The actual people whose lives you want to learn about are like, yeah, that's not important, or no, that's we're not interested in that, or like what we're really concerned about is this, or where you go and your field site no longer exists, or like many of my friends, COVID-19 global pandemic happens in the middle of their field work and you have to leave your field site, any number of contingencies. So I spent many years trying to work out what I would study before I started the field work, because that's how it works. I wrote a research proposal pitching the idea that I would study Ngakpa, non-celibate, non-monastic tantric ritual specialists or householders. I sometimes sort of half-jokingly call them tantric wizards. I would study them as a kind of practitioner and look at the way that they were relating to sort of institutionalized, centralized power and authority. And how I was going to do that, you always have to have a kind of real-world set of field sites as an anthropologist. So I had just, in a trip to India, stumbled upon this Ngakpa Jatsang, a kind of tantric college or gompa, like monastery temple, in MacLeod Ganj, or just outside MacLeod Ganj in North India, Himachal Pradesh, which had been founded by a very charismatic Ngakpa, who ended up becoming a kind of go-to weather controller. This is a common sort of job that Ngakpa do in Tibetan Himalayan societies. He became his name was Yeshe Dorje Rinpoche. He became the primary weather controller, sort of helping the Dalai Lama out during events and things like this. And I visited his gompa just randomly, met some people there, and thought, I subsequently then found out that some stuff had been written about his life in English. And I was just very struck by his trajectory of having been a wandering Chid practicing yogi exorcist who issued his own sort of shoehorning into a kind of monastic bureaucratic role. And then to see him come into exile and then be encouraged by the Dalai Lama to build his own monastic institution. So I was fascinated by this, and I sort of built some theoretical interventions that anthropologists might be interested in around this. Then I had like a long delay trying to get permissions and visas, and eventually arrived in MacLeod Ganj to start the clock of my long-term fieldwork at this institution. And when I got to the institution, it had languished significantly compared to even this sort of level of languishing that it had been in when I first visited in 2010, I think. So, like I said, not an uncommon thing for anthropologists, but still very nerve-wracking. I had this vision of being in a vibrant institution, a place where Ngakpa would be. One of the challenges that I discuss at length in the thesis is that part of Ngakpa's sort of unique way of living and orientations is that they don't live full-time in large-scale institutions like monks do. They may be in charge of institutions or grouped together at specific important moments to do collective ritual and things like that, but they also have families, they do other kinds of work, They might be alone in retreat or in group retreat for periods of time. So they're sort of shifty in that way. So a big challenge methodologically for me was like, okay, I'm going to study Ngakpa, but I don't know any Ngakpa closely. I don't have a teacher who I can sort of, I can't easily insert myself into any one Ngakpa's life. So I thought, okay, maybe let me build my research around a charismatic, deceased Ngakpa who had a sort of community role, who's well remembered by many people, who has living relatives, who has an institution. This was my workaround, and I thought that there would be Ngakpa and monks doing retreat there, because that was sort of the vision of this Sunam Kagyiling, the particular Ngakpa center that Nyingma Gompa, that Yeshe Dorje Rinpoche was encouraged to develop by His Holiness the Dalai Lama in the kind of, like late 70s, 80s. I felt very adrift. I didn't know how to insert myself into Ngakpa's lives. And I also realized, like many anthropologists do, that I'm probably not as great at field work and interviewing as I thought I was. Or at least you realize I'm quite a verbose, confident person in English, but I don't like barging into lamas' lives and demanding that they talk to me. And I struggled with that aspect of field work. I didn't really feel like I deserved to be human, really. Who am I? Like what existing relationships of trust and care did I have that would sort of justify me asking about, esoteric religious practices. So I really struggled, like a lot of anthropologists do. And I tried in the early months of my fieldwork to just learn as much as I could from as many people as possible. So I think you'll see when you read the dissertation, I really draw a lot on the perspectives of people who are maybe not the kinds of informants that you might think are the primary people you would ask about tantric Buddhist practices. I wanted to include the perspectives of ordinary lay Tibetans who were not trained in Tantra. Because often if you ask questions about Buddhism, many Tibetans will tell you, well, I'm not a Lama. I'm not going to just speak on that topic casually, like many Western converts will do. Speak to the authority. And then maybe the authority will say, I'm not the best Lama for that. So I actually refer to it as I think I call it the deferral of, it's a kind of recognizable pattern, the deferral of expertise. I was a bit at a loss. I thought, okay, well, my field site's not what I thought it would be. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know if I'm in the right place. I don't know if I need to be somewhere else. Why are you here? You should go to the Nepal border and go to villages where hereditary Ngakpa are the dominant religious specialists. This is a Gelugpa place, And I said to them, well, this is why I wanted to study this institution situated here. And I'm interested in Ngakpa and how they work in environments other than the kind of classical village ritual specialist scene. But yeah, it was a challenge. And then a real turning point for me was, well, I should say before that, it was good though, because it helped me to sort of cast a wide net and recognize the broader context. Recognize that if you want to understand the social life of tantric Buddhist expertise, you don't just have to talk to the tantric ritual specialists. There is a wider life in which practices and expertise and representations of religious authority or forms of knowledge circulate. And it involves people other than just the sort of obvious holders of those knowledge, the people that you often get deferred to, So I don't know, maybe you agree, maybe not. You can see that in the dissertation I tried to show that. And it was partly because of my own experiences in the field, my own trajectory. And then I would say a real turning point was when I met my teacher, Dr. Nida Chenagtsang, who's a Ngakpa from Tibet. And he's sort of one of that generation of younger Tibetan lamas who've moved directly from kind of like from their birth place in Tibet to Europe, or sort of not lived in the exile communities in Nepal and India in the same way. But I first encountered him through his writing. He's probably written more for general audiences about Ngakpa, about the kinds of knowledge that they possess, and sort of advocating for the value of this knowledge today and for its preservation, possibly more than anybody else. And he and his brother in Tibet run an NGO that works with the very important and kind of long-standing Ngakpa community in Rebgong, in Amdo, northeastern Tibet. And so I was aware of him and his writing, and as my Tibetan reading skills got better, I made sure to read what he had written about Ngakpa, and I was really amazed and appreciative. I was like, wow, here's someone who's doing something interesting. A native scholar practitioner speaking for his tradition, but not necessarily for other Ngakpa in religious texts written for elites, but for a wider public, responding to misunderstandings and critiques. And I just assumed that he still lived in Namdo. I was not aware of the fact that he had many students around the world and had been living in Italy for a long time. And then through a very sort of serendipitous series of events, I was able to make virtual and then direct physical contact with him when he visited India. And we really liked one another. He has, I think, a kind of ethnographic sensibility towards his own tradition. And I was happy to interact with a Tibetan scholar and practitioner who felt that sort of my angle on things as a scholar was aligned with his interests. He liked the translations that I had just done of my own accord of some excerpts of his writing. He liked the way I had framed them and contextualized them, contrasted them with neo-tantric practices. And so we developed a working relationship which has just continued to grow since 2016. And I now work for a publishing company, Buddhist publishing company, that we started to share translations of Dr. Nida's writing. I've received, he was so open about talking about things like sexual yoga practices or areas of Vajrayana expertise which not many people know about or have grounds to speak about. And he's an unusual figure because he really feels that it's more beneficial to maybe talk more openly about these things, to provide people some sort of frameworks and context and space for understanding these practices, so that if they do pursue them further, they'll do so in the right way, and will be able to identify what are misrepresentations and misuses of these ideas and practices. So we really are in a moment, I mentioned it briefly in the dissertation toward the end, we're in a moment right now of a kind of opening up around the sharing of esoteric Tantric Buddhist knowledge by Tibetan lineage masters. We're in also a moment of sort of anxiety around that. And so for me, my research took a very different turn when I met Nida and became associated with him. I started looking, because he's a Tibetan medical doctor and Ngakpa, I started looking more at the connection between traditional Tibetan medicine and tantric expertise. he introduced me to the lineage that he's most involved with personally as a practitioner, that he teaches most broadly around the world, the Yutap which is a kind of revelatory tradition from the 12th century that is essentially Vajrayana for doctors. It's kind of working physicians' teachings on householder tantric practice primarily. So that was also really I mean, before I met Nida, I had no idea that such things even existed. He was kind enough to, he wanted someone he liked and trusted to help him with translating and disseminating material in the right sort of way. I was only too happy to learn from him and continue to learn from him every day. So our partnership in the second half of my dissertation, I build the chapters around talking about my own trajectory, doing the sort of translation work, what was at stake at sharing information about certain topics like sexual yoga, because we've been working on a lot of projects to make information about this accessible, and to address issues around sexual abuse in the name of Tantra and so on, which are things that Genel is very, concerned about as a native practitioner and a lineage holder. So the latter part of the dissertation really focuses more squarely on sexual yoga practices, on our translation publication work, on other, I have 2 whole chapters about other translation projects in Tibetan exile related to sexological expertise that is both tantric and kind of not tantric at the same time. And I really get into that because these were also just things that fell into my lap. I met people who were talking about sexual health in exile, who were talking about issues about abuse in the name of Tantra, who were talking about celibacy versus non-celibacy, all issues that are deeply historically intertwined with the personhood, the subjectivity of Ngakpa. So my relationship with Nida as my teacher and research collaborator became really key. I don't think I'm alone in that as a scholar. I think that Buddhist textualist scholars have the same experiences, but they just don't write about it in their published work. If you scratch the surface of any textualist scholar, and you'll find either a whole lot of train wrecks or a whole lot of burnt bridges and damaged relationships, or you'll find like key significant partnerships that have really shaped and enabled research. But often those things get sort of, they get bracketed or even actively denied or not written about. Whereas our training as anthropologists is like, no, you lay your cards out on the table. You demonstrate the social processes and embodied relationships through which you came to learn something, through which you entered into people's lives, by means of which you experienced and understood things. So we believe that identifying our positionality and our and those intersubjective relationships, by talking directly about them, we actually add rigor and insight to our scholarship, rather than somehow turning our scholarship into anecdotal, navel-gazing, or subjective travel writing.
Like an eat, pray, love sort of thing. Yeah. Well, that is the tension, of course, on the one level regarding bias, an attempt, I think, in some disciplines to remove bias by removing oneself. The other aspect of it, of course, is part of the philosophical underpinnings of your discipline, is that the context of one's bias matters. Academically, it's not only an issue of disclosing bias, it's also an issue of actually the whole interrelationship is part of the discipline.
Knowledge is always produced within a sort of social context of interaction that shifts over time and place. And so in anthropology, we believe it's our job to kind of point that out and then think about it. Think about what that means.
So perhaps as a last question, one of the interesting methodological challenges you faced was this term scholar practitioner. In the course of your research, you did have a changing relationship to that term, or you were placed differently across that spectrum. And you write here, during the first year of my fieldwork, I was a knowledgeable but uninitiated outsider, one who likewise occupied the often awkward position of profane ethnographer. Unlike Mahamud, you talk previously about Lilith Mahamud, who'd done research into Freemasonry in Italy. Unlike Mahamud, however, I was regularly assumed to already be an initiated practitioner of the esoteric traditions which I was studying. Both lay and vocationally religious Tibetans in MacLeod Ganj and Kathmandu, my two primary field sites, tended to assume that white travellers to these places, who were dedicating considerable time to studying Tibetan language, culture and history, were converts to Tibetan Buddhism. One of the areas in which your evolution in terms of being a scholar practitioner came into relief was to do with Wang, or tantric empowerments. And here you write, when I began my doctoral dissertation fieldwork, I knew that attending an empowerment ceremony was how one became initiated into secret mantra or tantric Buddhism. And so I avoided going to such events because I wasn't sure I was ready to do this. I wanted to properly understand Wang and what it implied before I considered participating. So I'm wondering if you could talk a bit more about Wang in general, both in terms of how it's traditionally viewed and how it's actually applied today, and also how your personal position on the subject evolved over the course of the research and why it was such a thorny question for you.
Yeah, well, Wang, I go on after those lines that you read to then sort of play devil's advocate with myself and say, well, Wang is not some exclusive event in Tibetan and Himalayan communities. Empowerment ceremonies or initiations, I mentioned, I think that the last Kala Chakra empowerment, set of empowerments that the Dalai Lama gave, 80,000 people participated. Technically speaking, Wang ceremonies are the entry point into highest Yoga Tantra practices, into the most antinomian, secret practices of Vajrayana. But anybody who's, remotely familiar with Tibetan Buddhism will know that it's not hard to attend an empowerment ceremony. You can attend an empowerment ceremony via webcast. Many lamas have sort of made this innovation where they've said if your motivation is correct and your view is correct, just watching an empowerment happen miles away on your computer screen could be equivalent to physically being present and consuming consecrated samaya substances and so on, and taking vows with lamas. And the thing is, people also are engaging with these activities on different levels. The overwhelming majority of Tibetans and Himalayan kind of heritage Buddhists who go to empowerment ceremonies are not intending to practice the sadhanas for that highest yoga tantra yidam 4 times a day, every day for the rest of their life until they achieve Buddhahood for the sake of all sentient beings. But they are going there to, see the Lama, be in the Lama's presence, receive blessings from the Lama, make good karmic imprints and so on. Any number of reasons. And they occupy different positions and relationships to the mysteries involved that are being transmitted or maybe not being transmitted. I mentioned in the dissertation how Nida himself often sort of points this out by kind of joking with Buddhist converts. When he teaches on karma mudra, on partnered sexual yoga practice, he'll say, how many people here received, Wang for a yidam, highest yoga tantra yidam? People put up their hand and then he says, which one? And they disclose, and then he points out to them sometimes that, there's no particular reason why you need to disclose that fact. You don't need to be telling everyone what yidams you've received. That's a whole other thing. But they'll say, okay, well, all right, who's received the initiation or empowerment for sexual yoga practice? And, guaranteed, almost every single time, people are silent. Which is funny because historically, transmissions and explanations and empowerments for sexual yoga practice they're baked into the sort of fourfold model of Wang. It's just that people didn't even really know what they were receiving when they received it, or the extent to which the Wang embodies really a kind of A to Z of their practice and path. And there's various reasons for that, and we can wring our hands about that, or we can say as anthropologists, look, the meaning of Wang or its significance is not just in this Protestant sense of, Wang operates on many levels of participation and involvement. So that's why I mentioned in that section at the beginning of the dissertation, I say, well, it's kind of was a bit ridiculous and precious of me to be saying, like, I'm purposefully not going to go to Wang when people are carting their sleeping babies and dogs there freely. And there's any number of people there who are not going to technically do what they're supposed to do as a result of receiving that initiation. But I think for me, it was just a personal choice. It was about me grappling with my positionality. And I knew from before I entered the field, and I mentioned it in the dissertation in these terms, that anthropology for me was kind of a probationary period. From I was still in South Africa, I said, I will learn to read Tibetan. I will learn to understand Tibetan texts. I will get a cultural and historical literacy, because that will better inform any decision I may or may not make in the future to become a full-time practitioner. I want to know what it's going to mean for me to appropriately to interact with another community's spiritual, cultural traditions in an appropriate fashion. And so what I often said to people was, I said, and maybe I was projecting, but I think I saw a breath of relief sometimes when I said this, because so many Tibetans assumed I was Ngakpa, a white passing Buddhist, or Ngakpa Nyumba, like a crazy white Buddhist. Nyumba is something you hear fairly often. I think a lot of people assumed, well, why would I be here studying Buddhism if I wasn't a Buddhist? And then, lamas would say, what the hell are you doing? Like studying this, but you're not going to apply it to benefit yourself and other people? What a waste of time. So I was kind of in the midst of all that, and I would say to Tibetans who asked, I'd say, well, I'm not really a Buddhist, but I might become a dedicated practitioner, but I want to first check, I want to first learn more, I want to investigate. And that was something they could understand, because it's something that the Dalai Lama has encouraged for several years. He himself has actually quite strenuously discouraged foreigners from rushing to convert to Tibetan Buddhism as a replacement for investigating their relationship with their own heritage and traditions and religious upbringing, and maybe trying to heal and repair that. And he often tells people, like, don't rush into this because you want it to be something different, or like remedial. He'll say, like, what's the best religion? People will ask him, say, your religion, which is a fantastic response. And so I was aware of all these things. I'd also met a lot of, this is to be completely honest, I had met a lot in America and South Africa, a lot of Inji, not only white seeming, but non-Tibetan converts to Tibetan Buddhism, who had awful attitudes towards Tibetan people, who were, low-key racist and had enormous superiority complexes towards ordinary Tibetans and how they approached Buddhism. And I was just maybe to a fault, really not wanting to reproduce those kinds of really fascinating but strange positions and sort of subjectivities that people had, while also being open to and curious and compassionate towards the challenges of being a non-heritage Buddhist, of being a convert, trying to, internalize and apply and make real and relevant practices that came from one historical cultural context that you're totally divorced from. So yeah, I was spending a lot of time being quite careful about not positioning myself as an insider when I wasn't. But it was pretty simple. The too long didn't read version was I'd never met a lama. I'd never met a guru that I really connected with or trusted, or felt that I met lovely gurus who I thought were amazing and who I interviewed and developed friendships with, but I didn't feel like I could imagine them being my teacher. And then when I met Nida, that changed. And I told myself previously, right from the start, you'll become a practitioner when you have some understanding and context, and if and when you meet a teacher, a guide that you trust. And then so I guess by 2016, both those things happened, and now I'm much more free and relaxed about calling myself a Buddhist. But it took a while, yeah.
So Ben, this has been a totally thrilling conversation. I've read your dissertation a couple of times now, and it is just so fascinating. Whereabouts can people read that, or where can they reach you if they want to find out more about some of the things we've discussed? Of course, I'd like to have you on to dive into now more of the nitty-gritty details, and I have several questions about the contents, and perhaps we'll do that in future podcasts. But already, if people's interest is piqued, where can they read your dissertation, and where can they contact you?
Yeah, the dissertation is online, open access. So honestly, it's through ProQuest, but I would recommend just typing my name. Maybe you can put the full title of the dissertation or a link to the ProQuest site so people can read it in their browsers. It's 530 plus pages, so maybe not, but you can download it as a PDF as well. And I also have a personal sort of blog for research and working translation and reflections. That's called Perfumed Skull. So that's www.perfumed with a D, skull, all one word.com. I need to update it and add some new content, but yeah, there's lots of stuff to do with just things I get fixated on in relation to Tibetan Buddhism, Tibetan culture, esoteric religions, Western occultism, magic. I also am now working pretty much full-time for our Buddhist publishing company, which is called Sky Press Books. And so Dr. Nida, my colleague Christiana, and we've put out several books connected to the Yutok Nyingtik, Tibetan medicine, Ngakpa healing practices, sexual yoga over the last 4 years or so now, and we have several more publications in the pipeline. And we're actually just about to launch a new associated blog with Sky Press Books, where we'll be having weekly updates of translations of articles, curated resources of videos and interviews. We want it to be a kind of intermediary space so that if people are about to buy any of the books that we've put together with Dr. Nida or have read them already, this will be kind of extra supplementary content and work in progress. So that'll be coming out soon. in the next week or two. And so people can sort of expect more content there, similar stuff to what I've already put on my blog, but more specifically related to our publishing company. So yeah.
Dr. Ben Joffe, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to another Guru Viking podcast. For more interviews like these, as well as articles, videos, and guided meditations, visit www.guruviking.com.